Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Illinois Learn to Hunt, Deer Hunting Strategies, and Stand Placement. Before we get started tonight, we got a few reminders. Your microphones and webcams are disabled, so sit back, relax as we go through the presentation. If you have any questions while we're going through the presentation, we encourage you to use the Q&A window or the chat us. You can also have time at the end to have any survey quick and kind of give us an idea of what information we still kind of want to get at here as we learn more about hunting together. Our presenters tonight, we have Dan Stevens. Dan, you want to say hi?
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight.
And Adam, would you like to say hi?
How's it going, everyone? Hope you guys enjoy tonight.
And then we also have Curtis with us. Curtis, would you like to say hello?
How's it going, everybody?
Hello, Curtis. All right, and that makes me Jason. Welcome tonight, and we're excited about going through this presentation here. So, real quick, going over the course outline, we have deer ecology starting us off, a quick review of that, and then we're going to talk about understanding deer bed to feed patterns, which is the majority of a lot of hunting tactics spawned from that. Then we're going to talk about different types of bedding types and food resources that deer may use. And then we'll go through a seasonal approach and give you scenarios of deer bedding and setting up on deer bedding, depending on the type of year. Starting from picking a spot from that website. So give you an idea of what it's like to go through the steps and picking a spot out on some public land that may be available. Before we get started, though, we have a general survey that we'd want to go through real quick just to see how our participants' experience levels kind of range from and things like that. So just work your way through that pop-up right there, answer, and then we'll close that out and see what we're dealing with. All right, we're going to share results. So we have a few people who've never hunted before, and we got beginners and a few intermediates. So that's cool that we have a diverse group. And I'll tell you right now, depending on your hunting experience or how often you use satellite imagery, even experienced hunters are going to learn something, I think, from this course. This is a real fun one that we can actually kind of deep dive into some strategies here. So everybody's welcome on this one for sure. And we have a lot of people, the majority of people have taken our 101 or 102 course, and that's awesome. Welcome back. And then we have what type of deer hunting are you looking forward to doing? And majority are doing both. And then firearms and then archery. So that's awesome. All right, moving on. So now we're going to do a quick overview, and Curtis is going to start us off on this.
All right. Okay, thanks, Jason. 102, that's good. We haven't scared you off yet. Let's see what we can do this time. Just kidding. All right, let's get right into deer here. So optimal habitat. First thing you'll notice that the map over there on the left, there is a lot of bright orange or gold or whatever you want to call that color, telling us that white-tailed deer are extremely successful and can really adapt to a wide variety of habitats. You can find them in the desert, in the mountains, way up north in the bitter cold, and all the way down into Mexico and Central America, and even into South America. So a really wide range, a lot of different habitats. But here in Illinois, they are, I would say, equally as diverse, just right here in Illinois. So deer utilize a lot of different food types, and for a place to be really good habitat for deer, you want a mix of forest, preferably 20 to 50% forest or even more. And then you also want grass for cover and forbs. So all these deer kind of migrate through through the habitat seasonally. So they use some of these different habitat types at different times of year. Grass fields, of course, are really important for the fawning time and rearing fawns, and also deer eat a lot of grasses, especially when the grasses are dormant. But forbs constitute a big one of their food sources throughout the year. And then in the forest, of course, we've got the mast, the nuts, the hickory nuts, the acorns, beech nuts, that provides an excellent food source for them. But deer also browse on a lot of buds and even foliage from trees as well. So a good mix of habitat types is going to be really good for deer. They can utilize a lot of different food sources. And then, of course, it's Illinois. We've got a ton of grain farm crops that, of course, deer love too. So generally, when you've got corn and beans and things like that around, it's pretty easy to find where the deer are feeding at. Now, in this next slide here, we're going to get into, till it pops up here, more of the deer behavior. So now a big thing that hunters talk about is the rut. And this rut is going to center around white-tailed deer breeding, which actually occurs in early to mid-November across a lot of the Midwest. But really this, what's called rutting behavior or breeding behavior, is elongated and really starts in October and can go into December for a little secondary rut that tends to pop up in the late season. But that peak is going to be mid-November. And when this rutting behavior in the fall time, when the rutting behavior peaks, males are going to be following females. So one interesting thing about deer is adult deer, they're almost split up for most of the year by sex. So adult bucks and adult does, they use different beds, they may use different trails, even different food sources in some cases. But of course, all that changes once the hormones get flowing. And of course, that's a really exciting time to hunt for a number of reasons. But not just during the rut, but year round. The most active time for deer activity is going to be what we call the crepuscular time. So this is going to be the low light period, just after sun up and just before sundown. So deer, especially pressured deer, they can do a lot of their movement nocturnally at nighttime. So catching them in them crepuscular times is a real good time to hunt. Now, one thing that deer are famous for is an incredibly excellent sense of smell. And we're going to talk about that a lot in this webinar. That is their main line of defense. Now they've got good eyesight and hearing as well, so they could hear you, they could see you. All that stuff definitely does happen, but I'd venture to say probably better than 75% of the time when a deer spooks and blows, snorts, runs out on you, it's because that deer smelled you, probably didn't see you or hear you. So be talking about that a lot, and knowing the wind and kind of where your scent's going. And then a cool thing about fawns, they're precocious. So they fall and hit the ground, and it's not too much longer, and they're running around and basically just a miniature version of a deer at that portion. So not quite like human babies that require years and years, sometimes even more than 18 years of tender love and care. Deer are much more ready to hit the ground running. So, and when you're hunting, one little tip is when there's a group of antlerless deer, a lot of times it's going to be the fawns who are the leader on the trail. And they're generally one or two, occasionally three in rare circumstances. But the mom, the mature doe, is probably going to be the last one coming down the trail. All right, so most of deer hunting can really be boiled down to bed to feed pattern. So other than, like I mentioned, the hormones kind of affecting what happens in the rut, most everything that a deer is going to do is going to be revolving on bed to feed, bed to feed. And even during the rut, it is as well, because the does are still doing that same pattern, bedding often, feeding often. It's just that the bucks are, checking up on them doing that, and they're spending more of their time and effort checking up on does rather than feeding. But so if you can establish, and we already mentioned that the feeding spots are going to be super easy to pick out, your cornfields, your grain crop fields, but also your big stands of white oaks. Those things are typically going to stand out, but it's the bedding areas that might be a little bit more difficult to pick out. And that's what we're really going to try to help you narrow in on and find during this webinar. So we're going to get into some more details about beds and how to find them here in these next few slides. I'll kind of give you an intro to deer bedding. So now here's an example of an aerial photo that's showing you a feeding area and what's a doe bedding area. So now, once you establish these bedding areas, and we're going to talk more about how to find them, but let's just say you hike around, you've been doing a lot of scouting. If you jump up deer, right, a group of does and the white flags pop up, and maybe you jump them up 2 or 3 different times from the same area, you can be pretty sure that's probably a doe bedding area. So that would be a good little area to mark on your map. And then you probably know the feeding areas too. You get that marked on your map. Then when you go home and you look at your map, like what's on our screen here, it becomes very obvious that there's a perfect little pinch point right between what is a very nice bedding area and that nice feeding area. And that's right there on the X. The X marks the spot. And if you're new to looking at aerial photographs or topography or anything like that, you may not know what those little lines are, but those little lines actually signal a change in elevation. So you see those 3 lines close together, just basically south of that X, that's going to be a little bit of a ridge. And the deer that are down in that doe bedding area, they've got no reason to climb up that little hill and back down it to get to that feeding area. So 9 times out of 10, they're going to walk right by that X and hopefully right in your range. So, and in this point, the northern edge of your pinch point is that little stream river. So your pinch points can be terrain like that ridge. It can be actual boundaries like roads or rivers, which of course deer can cross. But in general, they're going to take the easiest path of least resistance. So the X puts you in a good spot to be right in range of some deer. I also like how these 2 polygons on the map, they look like lungs. So it's a reminder of where you want to shoot too. Let me check the questions here. Okay, how can you deal with deer bedding near the edge of an ag field? So this is one thing that pops up a lot, and all the bow hunters really get excited as soon as the the corn really starts getting picked, because yeah, especially standing cornfields make amazing deer bedding areas, and there's basically a snack on every stalk. So it can be tough, and there's a famous hunter by the name of Bob Folkrod who actually used to have a style of bow hunting where he would spot and stalk through cornfields, which is a really advanced hunting method. But for most of us, we're going to, we're going to be much more successful once that corn gets off and the deer get back in the woods, because quite frankly, they can just be hard to hunt when they're out there. So, if you can get in without jumping the deer up and get close and observe, maybe you'll have a shot, and then at least you'll know as soon as the corn gets picked or whatever's in the ag field, the deer will probably choose a different bedding site at that time. But
Yeah, and I'd like to add one more point to that, Curtis, too. And this will become evident the further we get through this webinar tonight, is that I typically don't set up on a bedding site. So let's say you have a deer bedded, on the edge of an ag field, maybe it's even cut at that point. I'm not going to get very close to that individual deer when I'm hunting. What I'm hoping to do is basically devise where point A is, where point B is. So point A is going to be his bedding area, point B is going to be feeding, and try to pick a spot that's in between those two areas where he's going to walk through. So very commonly, we're not setting up on the actual bedding sites. And that'll, again, become more evident as we go through more of these examples.
Yeah, that's a good point, Dan. And that there are some people who do actively hunt beds, and that is a hunting style. But again, that's a really advanced hunting style, because when you do spook a deer or disturb them on their bed, that's usually going to alter their behavior, and they may not use that bedding anymore. So most people, yeah, like Dan said, you want to hunt between the bedding and the feed is going to give you a better chance of not spooking the critters, but still being a good chance to get your shot. Okay, and then so we can see in this top picture there kind of what a deer bed would look like with the deer not in it. And it looks just like you'd expect, kind of a little trampled down area of vegetation that's about the size of a deer. And a lot of times if you see several of those together, then you can be pretty sure you found a doe, or it would be an antlerless deer bedding area, because of course some of the fawns are probably button bucks. But then if you do find a single bed, and a lot of times it'll be a little bit bigger, and a lot of times there'll be some sort of structure to guard that bed from one side. Now you can be pretty sure that you're probably looking at a buck bed. And so the sexes will use different bedding areas. And so if you find buck beds and doe beds, you can label those on your maps as such, and it'll really help you, once you start looking at aerial photos, get a good idea of what the deer are doing out on the landscape. But yeah, bedding areas are chosen with great care. Remember, these deer, this is their house. They gotta live out there, whether it's like some of you today, if you're like us here in Champaign, you got a little snow and sleet and ice and stuff today. So obviously deer, when they pick their bedding locations, they're going to choose those with great care to try to give themselves the most comfort possible. So in these next couple slides, we'll talk a little bit more about some of these good areas. And another good thing to point out is that average of about 30 minutes for bedding areas. So deer bed a lot of different times in a given day, and so they'll leave a lot of different signs out there. They're not going to sit in the same bed typically for the entirety of a day. But weather is definitely going to be one of the big driving forces that's going to dictate what bedding location they choose. And they're going to take advantage of what's there to give them the best little microclimate that they can have. So on a day like today, which was, I don't know, I'd say pretty crummy for late April, they're probably trying to find a little bit of thicker cover to try to keep that snow and sleet from hitting them so hard. And they may have tried to seek out some south facing slopes today so that they could get a little thermal warming from the sun if they can stay in the sun. So, and on the vice versa of that, if it's really warm, like it's probably going to get before maybe just a few days from now, those same deer are going to be bedding potentially on northern facing aspects, or try to get in a place where they can be shaded and get away from the sun and stay as cool as possible. So definitely be thinking about what the conditions are when you're basically deciding which bedding areas to hunt. And it's not only just really crappy weather that can send deer into thick cover, but also a big increase in pressure can do that as well. So you may notice maybe you are archery hunting and then the firearm season starts, which generally increases the pressure. After that, you may see that some of the bedding areas that are in the thickest and nastiest brush on the whole property, that might be the places that they seek out. Even if the weather may not be bad, it might be the pressure that sends them there. So but yeah, a good rule of thumb basically is just, if you can keep a journal and keep track of the weather conditions, and then also all the deer movement and activity that you see in a given day, some of these things will really start taking shape, and you'll start to think like a deer, I guess, and be like, oh man, it's pretty windy, pretty sleeting. I bet the deer are bedding over here in this hollow. I'm gonna hunt this stand today. And that's when it really gets fun. And that's the challenge that'll keep you up at nights waiting for shooting time, basically. Okay, yeah, so I mentioned this already, but on some of the colder days, and especially if we get a good amount of snow, the deer may not move much at all. They could, if they have a nice south facing slope, they can get in the sun, they may just sit there. Their bodies are constructed in such a way that when the weather gets really bad, they kind of can go into this like starvation diet. And obviously they don't hibernate or do anything like that, but their metabolism can slow down, and they just put their energy into staying warm and basically wait for warmer times, which of course sounds really weird to us because we're used to eating all the time and as much as we want and all that kind of good stuff. But of course, wild critters, they got to have some more creative adaptations to make it out there on their own, because they don't have quite all the creature comforts that we do. But that buck there, he looks pretty comfy to me. Okay, and then topography is also going to impact this. And, topography impacts the wind speed and direction. So, in general, no matter which way the wind is going, there's usually going to be thermal currents going up. So, scent also travels up as well as with the wind. So, you got to keep that in mind. It doesn't travel down nearly so easily. So, when you're in the lowlands, you got to be a little bit more careful than you're in the uplands, I suppose. But topography also is going to impact the solar radiation, like we talked about. If you do get a really big cold snap all of a sudden, that's going to be a good clue to look at your south facing aspects in those bedding areas, or the vice versa. Of course, if you're archery hunting in the early season and it gets really hot, you might be swatting a lot of mosquitoes out there, but at least you might be able to narrow down that the deer might be in the northern facing places and maybe shady spots where they can get out of the sun. And then you'll have to keep all these topography things in your mind when you're setting your stand up too. Thinking about scent going up, and then also with the wind, that could change where you're going to put your stand. Now, in this case, we know the deer are probably going to walk in that lowlands, probably between that little turn in the river and that ridge spot. So we're probably going to be in the same level of the deer or even above, which is great. But if it was vice versa and the deer were bedding up on that slope side, we would just want to be careful not to be down slope from them, because that's going to be, even if the wind's going the other direction, being down slope from a bedding area is definitely not good. They're going to get a waft of your scent at some point or another. I don't care how many layers of scent blocker you're using. Okay, the question, optimal temperature for deer movement. Well, they're going to move basically in all temperatures, other than when it gets real bad, and especially if the snow gets deep, they're not good at walking in deep snow. So they will move in all temperatures. They don't like really cold or really hot, just like us. So really the prime is going to be what's comfortable to us, is probably going to be make the most movement for them. Or even a little colder, because once deer start getting cold, that just increases their urgency to feed, because they've got to put on that fat to make it through the winter. But yeah, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan, and he's going to start to dive more into some bedding locations.
Perfect. Thanks, Curtis. Yeah, so now Curtis gave kind of a quick overview on bedding, and now we're going to dive into some very specific bedding examples and go over how you can use these in kind of your hunt planning process. So this is arguably my favorite part of the webinar. I promise, whether you're a brand new deer hunter, or you're a very experienced deer hunter, I imagine a few of these common bedding sites, if you start to work them into your deer hunting this fall, that you'll find a lot of success with it. But we'll first start off with south-facing slope bedding. So Curtis kind of briefly discussed this, but the whole idea of focusing on these south-facing slopes is that they experience more solar radiation for longer periods of the day. And so what does that mean? That means that they're generally going to be warmer, and that also impacts the vegetation communities that are there. Again, they're constantly drier soils, just because, again, they're going to receive more warmth throughout the day. And so that really impacts how wildlife use these slopes. And so if you're not familiar with how to identify a south-facing slope, the easiest way is to pull up a topographic map like you see here. There's a few really good kind of free online resources that you can use for topo maps. The U.S. Geological Survey has some pretty good topographic maps. And then, of course, there's a lot of different mobile applications like Onyx Hunt, My Hunt Stand. There's a few others that are out there on the market, so you can get these topo layers. But essentially, when we're looking at topo layers, you can see these kind of brown lines kind of snaking across the screen. Those are referred to as contour lines, and those show us elevation changes out there in kind of a 3D environment, and it represents it in a 2D form, so we can easily understand it. And there's a few things to keep in mind with contour lines before we get too much further. They're never going to intersect. And you can kind of view it like a cross section of the surface of the earth. So everything along the same contour line is going to be at the same exact elevation above sea level. And in this specific map, each of these contour lines is a 10-foot interval. And so here we can see we have about a 50-foot elevation change from the bottom of that slope to the top. And you can see that slope is predominantly facing in the south direction. And so that's going to be extremely productive during these during these colder temperature days. Now, in complete contrast, you can also focus on north-facing slopes on particularly warm days. We had a question from Rick a few minutes ago that Curtis addressed that basically asked optimal temperature for deer hunting. And like Curtis said, there's really not a right answer. It's very seasonally dependent. It's going to change day to day. But what I'm particularly looking for as a deer hunter is I focus on changing weather patterns. And so if you have, let's say, 5 or 6 days of really cold, 10-degree weather, very windy, and then you have a warm front come through and maybe you get up to, 40 with no wind, that's the day I'm going to go out. And kind of the same is in reverse. So if it's a very warm stretch and you have a cold front come through, those are the days I'm going to be out as well, those changing weather patterns. And that's why it's so important to think about the aspect of the slope in relation to the current weather. So again, south-facing slopes are great in colder weather, particularly if you're interested in rabbit or squirrel hunting. In real cold weather, you'll see them utilizing a lot of south-facing slopes. So they also kind of follow the same trend as many other species do. So now we're going to get into one that's a little bit more technical. And you can see I have a little graphic here on the right that illustrates what many people call thermals. And Curtis kind of briefly discussed this, but thermals are essentially rising columns of air. So as the sun comes up in the morning, it starts to heat the surface of the earth. And that form, we all know that kind of warm air rises. And so that creates these columns of warm air. And so if you're ever out and about and you see, vultures kind of circling and there's maybe 4 or 5 all circling in one area, a lot of times that's because there's a very strong thermal current there. And deer will also use that to their advantage, because not only does it allow them to kind of be a little bit more secure in their bedding, but in this case, so I guess I should explain leeward bedding a little bit too. So leeward bedding is essentially the downwind side of a slope. So the leeward side, there's going to be no wind hitting that slope. And so in this specific example, you can see the wind is coming out of the north. The potential bedding location is on the southern portion of that slope. So that's considered the leeward side. And so this gives a deer in this specific example a lot of advantages. So not only does this deer kind of have an elevated view because he's kind of up on the slope, but he's also got this predominant wind from his back, pulling the wind up the ridge, over top and down to him. So he can smell anything coming from the opposite side of the ridge. But these thermals, they're also going to create this kind of wind tunnel. So the thermals are going to pull the scent up from in front of him, as that dominant wind is going to be pushing it from the back. And so he has a really strong chance of being able to smell out any danger. And as Curtis mentioned earlier, obviously the sense of smell is kind of their key predatory avoidance technique, is that sense of smell. And so having a position like this where they can scent check in multiple directions and have a very good line of sight is a very productive bedding site. And you'll find a lot of bucks using examples very similar to this.
Hey, Dan.
Yeah.
So when, given how well covered they are by checking their scent from both directions, this is a time where you wouldn't really move in on this at all, and you kind of use this as an area to maybe scout out some other time when you're not afraid to push the deer, but kind of use that as a starting point to look for that bedding area, and then set up somewhere else where you think that deer is going to be moving to.
Correct. That's a great point. And so as we kind of progress through this webinar, we'll take a very seasonal approach. And so we'll start out with early October when archery season starts, and kind of transition through the season and how we would hunt some of these areas. But when I'm identifying bedding areas and potential bedding areas, I'm typically not doing this during the season. A lot of this I'm going to have kind of sketched out and illustrated before the season starts, especially if you're, so everyone has different motivations for hunting, right? Some people are very interested in harvesting that mature buck, getting that big buck, that big trophy buck on the wall. Other people are just looking to fill your freezer. Now, if you're interested in getting that trophy buck, I would stay out of these areas once season starts. I would not get too close to those bedding sites, because a buck, again, he's going to have 5 or 6 different bedding sites established. And as you can see in this example, this is kind of a good time to bring it up, Jason. So thanks for that. This specific bedding location doesn't work very well out of a west or an east wind. And so very commonly when a buck is using a bed, he is using that bed with a very, very, very specific wind direction. And so oftentimes if you're out walking around and you happen to jump up a buck out of his bed, mark where that location is and immediately mark what that predominant wind direction is, because that's going to give you a pretty good indication of when he's going to use that bed again. But typically, if you jump a buck out of a bed that he felt very comfortable in, it might be a week or two before they are willing to use that bed again. So I typically try to stay, a couple hundred yards away once I identify that that's a bed, and then try to get onto that bed to feed pattern. Now, this next example is arguably my favorite type of buck bedding habitat. This is the one I've had the most success on public land in Illinois, and this is ridge point bedding. And so again, we're looking at topographic maps. So we'll kind of break it down and slow things down a little bit. But you can see on this northern side of the map, we have this gimlet branch running through. That's essentially a small creek. And so that already tells us that chances are that's the lowest part of elevation kind of in this map that you're seeing. And so we can start to work back and we can see where that potential X is. We see a really nice solid ridge that's a pretty steep slope down to the bottom of that drainage, but then has a little bit of a kind of a flattish portion on top. But these ridge points are, they kind of kill multiple birds with one stone, so to speak. So it's very similar to the leeward bedding. Again, he's only going to use this specific bedding example in a very specific wind direction. And when they're sitting in this, they're going to be facing with the wind coming over their back. And so you can see where that X is on that little peninsula that's kind of pointing out into that valley. So it's a ridge point. He's going to sit up there with his back to the predominant wind. Now, if anything tries to, come up from his back and come up from the ridge, he has a really good chance to quickly smell it and make his escape. What he can also do is sit in this area, overlook this entire bottomland area, and just keep his eye out for danger. He's also going to use his ears and get really good coverage of the sound that's in the area just because he's so elevated. But this is where that kind of concept of thermals comes back into play again. So he's going to be close to the edge of that ridge, and those thermals are going to be pulling the scent up from the valley, up the face of that slope to him. So he can again sit here and scent check multiple sides of that slope, very similar to where he could in leeward bedding. And if you look a little bit closer at this map, you can probably pick out a few other examples of where ridge points would be. In this specific example, there's about 3 or 4 that are here, but this is a really good way to find bedded bucks, particularly later in the year as they get more and more pressured. They're going to be a little bit more selective in their bedding sites. They know the pressure's out there. They've been bumped out of beds. They're trying to find somewhere safe. And areas like this give them a really good option to have kind of total coverage and total safety of all the areas kind of surrounding them. Up next, we're going to talk about oxbow bedding. Now, this one certainly isn't the most common across the landscape. We don't have a ton of oxbows in Illinois, but your first question is likely going to be, what is an oxbow? And so you can see here in this specific example, we have basically the river coming to a bend, and it's almost at the point that it's going to create an island out of this little oxbow, but it's not quite there. These are another fantastic buck bedding area because, again, it gives them a lot of avenues for escape routes, but keeps them in a safe position where they can monitor pretty much everything that's coming from any direction. And so in an area like this, that buck is going to be bedded just like he was on the ridge point. He's going to have the wind at his back. He's going to be facing out into the creek, and he'll be able to scent check anything coming from behind him, anything coming from the left or the front. Should have to go through water, which is going to give him a pretty good chance of hearing them, and then he can quickly make his escape. So when I find oxbows, I'll just go ahead and say they are very, very, very tough to hunt. And you can kind of just see that deer, for lack of a better term, has kind of one way he's going to work out of this area. He's going to walk through that oxbow basically all the way back to the mainland. And you could certainly set up at that kind of gap where the oxbow joins back with the mainland. But the issue is, remember, he's only choosing that with the wind blowing in his favor from that direction. And so very often in a scenario like this, I might be, on the south side and try to see if he'll kind of snake around and do kind of a curling motion. Or I might try to set up on the north side and maybe try to draw him in with some calling scenarios or these type of things. But oxbow bedding is common for deer. It's just not common on the landscape in Illinois, but if it is, it can certainly be productive. It's a very common place to find big, mature bedded bucks. And so, as I mentioned, when they leave, they're going to go that way. And now that we've kind of talked a little bit about bedding, we're going to start to transition to food a little bit. And then after we get through this quick food section, we're really going to dive in and go over some real strategic examples of how to hunt deer throughout the season. So we'll start off in early October and go all the way through late January and give a few examples of different strategies and tactics to try out. But first, we want to talk about arguably the biggest food source for deer outside of agriculture products in Illinois is going to be acorns. Every deer hunter knows about acorns. They're important for deer. They're important for many, many, many species of wildlife. But I'm going to tell you a secret that not a lot of hunters know about. And if you've been to several of our deer hunting or even squirrel hunting webinars, you've probably heard us discuss this a little bit. But that's the concept that there are basically two groups of acorns. There's white oak acorns and red oak acorns. And we'll get to the distinctions between the two in a minute. But acorn production is cyclical. So you're going to have higher yields some years versus other years. And so deer will oftentimes shift their range to kind of take advantage of these acorn populations. And so it's important as a hunter to monitor that and to keep track of this acorn production. If you see a really strong acorn crop, then I would start focusing a lot of my efforts on acorns rather than on some of the other food sources like browsing or even some soybeans or row crops. Now, in years when acorn production is low, so maybe we have a bad drought or maybe we have too much water and it just really screws up the acorn development, that's when browsing is going to become very important. And so browsing is essentially a way of feeding where deer are going to feed on twigs, on bark, on little flower buds, on fruit buds, basically anything that they can get their mouth on, they will eat. Okay, but here we go. If you take one thing away from this webinar tonight, if it's this, and if you implement this in your deer hunting strategy, I promise that you'll see a big change in how many deer that you see out in the woods. But again, I want to kind of break it down. So there's essentially two groups of acorns or of oak trees. Now, obviously, there's dozens and hundreds and maybe even thousands of different oak species across the world. There's several dozen here in Illinois. So we're just going to simplify it by the two groups. And so there's a red oak group and a white oak group. Now there's multiple species in each of these groups, but the big distinction is their acorn production. That's a very important kind of description between these two groups. So the white oaks, they will have a 1-year acorn maturation, where the red oaks, it takes 2 years to produce an acorn. Now that doesn't mean that red oaks only drop acorns every year or every other year. They still drop them every single year. It just takes 2 full growing cycles, 2 full growing seasons for that specific acorn on a red oak to mature and to drop. And so you may wonder, well, why is that important? But the real important thing is red oaks are excellent to have on the landscape because they allow you to have a little bit more flexibility in the food that's being offered to those deer. So let's say we have a very dry spring and the white oaks just don't have time to produce. They don't really have a big acorn crop. The advantage is the red oaks have already had 1 full year of growing. So they already have some acorns that are maturing and producing. And so those years where it's a drought, I might shift to focus on red oaks. Now, white oaks are the preferred acorn for deer, for squirrel, for turkey, for most species, because they have a lower amount of tannic acid content. So they're more palatable and they're not as bitter like the red oaks. So the red oaks are going to be higher in tannin, which makes them a little bit more bitter. But on the flip side, that gives them yet another advantage because that tannin allows them to remain viable on the forest floor a lot longer than the white oaks will. So when a white oak hits the ground, if it's not consumed rather quickly, it's going to rot. And so you'll actually be able to, if you focus on looking at the trees in your area and figuring out what are white oaks versus red oaks, and you monitor deer activity, there will be a point where you start to notice a shift where it seems like all the white oaks have started to be consumed and all the deer are starting to transition to these red oak areas. And now how do we tell the difference between the two? And so we're going to dive into that here in this next slide. So when you're looking at oak leaves, again, we're going to discuss the two main groups, the red oak versus white oak. The key distinction between the two is going to be what the leaves look like. And so you can see here on the left where the arrow is pointing, that's going to be a red oak. On the white, or on the right, yeah, that works well. On the right, we have a white oak. And you can see on the left, these lobes essentially come to a point and have what looks like little hair-like projections at the end of each kind of lobe. And those are referred to as bristle tips. Every species of oak that is in the red oak family or the red oak group will possess these bristle tips. So if you ever get to an oak tree and you see these bristle tips, boom, you know it's a red oak. So that immediately tells you, okay, A, it's not their favorite food source, but they'll eat it. B, it's kind of drought resistant and weather resistant. And C, it lasts longer on the ground. Now, if you don't see any lobe or any bristle tips on the lobes, that immediately tells you that's a white oak, which is a favorable acorn for deer, but it does get consumed rather quickly. And if it's not consumed, they have a tendency to decay a little bit faster on the forest floor. All right, controlling your scent. So deer, obviously, like Curtis mentioned, have an excellent sense of smell. And so that's the main primary sense that we're going to be trying to fool when we're out there deer hunting, is going to be their sense of smell. And that's why it's really important to pay attention to the wind direction. And again, like we discussed a little bit earlier, it's not necessarily just the predominant kind of gusty winds, but it's also how these thermals kind of pull rising air up, and that's also going to pull your scent molecules and your scent up. And so if you're at the bottom of a valley and there's a deer on the ridge and it's been a kind of a warm sunny day, your scent is going to be pulled right up that ridge, and they're going to be pretty quickly to be able to bust you and smell you. So not only do you need to worry about wind direction, but also some of these thermals. And so what a lot of hunters, I don't necessarily subscribe to this rule of thought, but it's something you'll see a lot in kind of the hunting community and in hunting books and shows and what have you. This concept of they hunt ridges in the morning and they hunt the draws in the evening. And a lot of that is because, again, if you're up, already elevated on top of a ridge and that morning sun creates these thermals, then it's just going to pull your scent kind of straight out of the sky and gone. But if you're in the valley, again, like I just mentioned, it's going to pull it up that entire slope. So some people subscribe to that rule of thought. But as we transition and kind of move into a more strategic approach for this webinar, you'll start to understand why I don't always follow that trend. All right, so if you can just go ahead and skip that slide real quick, Jason. So yeah, like we mentioned, now we're going to really dive into hunting strategies. We're going to take a very seasonal approach. So we're going to start where deer season starts, and we're going to end where deer season ends. And Adam Wojciechowski and I are going to be kind of tag teaming this section, so you'll kind of hear him jump in and give his thoughts as we progress. But we're first going to start off with early October. Obviously, in Illinois, archery season starts October 1st. And now early October, you have quite a few advantages working to your favor. We've had this long period of summer where deer have just been able to basically do their own thing. They don't feel pressured. A lot of their habits change. They're going to be out in daylight a lot more at this time of year than they will later on in the season. And it's a great opportunity to get out there before it gets too cold, before it gets too pressured, and the deer really start to pick up on people hunting. Now, in early October, I personally really like to focus on basically feeding areas and high traffic areas. So as Curtis mentioned earlier, kind of this basic bed to feed pattern, that's what I'm focused on a lot during this kind of early October period, because deer this time of year are very, very predictable. Because again, they haven't been pressured for 7, almost 8 months in some cases. They've just kind of had that big chunk of habitat to themselves. They're not getting chased out at 4 a.m. by people wearing flashlights and clanking around with tree stands. So they're a lot more comfortable, and that allows them to be a lot easily patterned. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on these feeding areas. And typically in early October, the acorns haven't really started to drop yet. And so you're going to be focused in a lot of cases on ag fields, whether it's corn, soybeans, or some other crops. But what I like to say is, a lot of people, when they hear that, they're like, well, crap, I hunt public land. We don't have, corn and soybeans. That's great. I would much prefer to hunt areas that don't have agriculture crops, because think about it. If you have an entire, square mile, so 640 acres of corn, those deer can enter anywhere. They can leave anywhere. They can bed in there. And so I personally try to find areas that really don't have a lot of agriculture crops in general. But if they do, that's when I'm going to do what I call reconnaissance sits. And so for the first maybe 3 days, sometimes I even do it before the season starts, I'll just go up in a tree in my tree stand and just kind of sit there and watch how deer are entering a specific feeding site, how they're leaving through a feeding site, maybe how they're feeding through a specific field. And that's going to tell you a lot about how these deer utilize that area. And you can also use trail cameras to kind of do the same thing for you without having to do these kind of reconnaissance sits.
Yeah, great point there, Dan. I was going to bring the reconnaissance sits up as well. Another quick thing to mention there, I know for the past few seasons, the first few days of October were really hot. Focusing on water could be just as important as that food source. So they might hit the water before they hit the food. So if you do find like a little bit of a pond, obviously the areas we hunt here, there's a river that kind of borders the whole area. But if you can find a smaller body of water that's tucked up in the woods and some thicker cover, that could also lead you to a very good hunting spot.
Good point. And then another thing I'd like to throw in too is, since Adam kind of brought up this concept of hunting when it's warm. Now, me personally, if it's like last year, it was, I think 78 degrees on opening day with a high in the 80s. I personally will not go out that day. And now you can still have an incredibly successful hunt. But what gets really tricky is meat quality, meat handling, and meat care. And so personally, I like to wait till it cools down a little bit, just to allow me a little bit more time to recover that animal after the shot, so that I don't have to rush it too much and then bump them out and they kind of keep on running, and then I have to track even further. So just kind of be thinking of that too, as you're planning your early season hunts, that again, if the weather's not right, I personally will just stay home. There's plenty of other opportunities out there. But again, that's just kind of a personal decision you need to make. But here's kind of, again, we've shown this example a few times, but this is the place I hunted opening day for 2 or 3 years now. This is a public DNR site. There's a bedding area right here, a nice, beautiful feeding area. And then you have arguably, I think, the most definitive funnel that I've found in Illinois in quite some time. And so as Curtis mentioned, when he showed this graphic a little bit earlier, you have this really nice steep ridge that kind of blocks off anything trying to go kind of southeast. So deer are lazy, just like us. They like to take the path of least resistance. So like Curtis said, why would they go up, over, and down instead of just following that slope around, which is what happens in a lot of cases. But in this example, you also have this kind of oxbow type area kind of sneaking in from the north. And so you have this real beautiful funnel where they basically have to walk within 60 yards of you in either direction. So you kind of have 30 yards to your right, 30 yards to your left for them to kind of move through that area. So anything that walks from that bedding area to that feeding area should theoretically pass within your effective range. And so those are the type of areas that I'm really keen on during the early season.
Hey, Dan, one thing I thought about talking about hunting early season is the mosquitoes. And, obviously deer having such a good sense of smell, you're probably not going to be dousing the deep woods off. But I found a thermocell can be.
I use the same thing. Yep.
Yeah, awesome. So if those skeeters are driving you crazy, thermocell, I think they're about $20 and they're worth 10 times that. But don't tell them I said that, because
That's a great tip. So now as we kind of transition through October, we hit what a lot of people call the October lull. And so this is kind of that weird stage between early season, when deer aren't pressured, they really don't know what's going on, and rut, and kind of pre-rut. And so a lot of people will call this the October lull, and that's kind of when you start seeing things. We have a question from Dan. What is Thermacell? So Thermacell is essentially a little product that's propane, or it's either propane or butane. I can't recall off the top of my head, but it's basically a gas-powered insect repellent. So you'll put a little pad over the fence and it kind of heats up with the propane or butane cartridge. They're totally small. I mean, they're kind of the size of an old GPS unit that old hunters used to carry back in the day. Obviously now a lot of us carry cell phones, but they're kind of the size of a graphic calculator, but maybe 2 inches thick. But they're really nice just to hang on your back. And they do sell, like Curtis mentioned, kind of dirt or scent free insect carts that you can kind of throw in there, and it just creates kind of a bubble around you. I use them a lot when I'm fishing and stuff. Again, this isn't a product endorsement, just kind of an overview and kind of example of what's out there. But now that we kind of move into this October lull, so we're between early season and we're between pre-rut. So what are we focused on? This is where it gets a little tough, particularly in public land, but I'm hoping with this example, it can kind of hope to alleviate some of those concerns. And so what I like to focus on in this kind of October lull, so this is typically October 10th to maybe the 20th through the 25th or so, is kind of this time period. But I'm going to be focusing on staging areas. And so you may ask, well, what's a staging area? And they're generally a location that's kind of just outside of the buck's bedding area where it's comfortable being in daylight. And so obviously, we've been through deer season for a few weeks. Deer are starting to notice that people are in the woods. They're starting to notice hunters. And so they're getting a little bit more daylight sensitive. And so during this October lull, you hear a lot of people who just kind of give up for these 2 or 3 weeks because they say the deer go nocturnal. It's hard to pattern them. It's hard to find them. And that can be true if you're kind of looking in the wrong spot. And so a lot of times focusing on these staging areas is a great advantage. And we've talked several slides about how to find buck bedding areas. Very often a staging area is just going to be kind of a smaller radius around that bedding site. And so it's a great option. You can see in this specific example, that deer may stand in that staging area for an hour, for 2 hours until it feels comfortable. Very often when a deer enters a field, if you see a deer just kind of walking casually from the woods to the field, chances are that deer's been there for probably 10 or 15 minutes and you just didn't realize it. They don't like to just walk out carelessly through the field. They're going to stand on that edge. They're going to just be as still as they can. They're going to sniff, and they're just going to look, and they're just going to watch. And during this October lull period, that becomes a little bit more cognizant, and it becomes a much more lengthy process, just because, again, they know the pressure's there, but their hormones haven't started taking them to this other place that we're going to go here soon. So October lull, I'm still going to be focused on kind of that bed to feed pattern, but I'm going to be focused on kind of the outside of the feeding area, trying to catch these deer as they just kind of monitor that feeding area. And if you have a really strong bed to feed pattern, like we kind of showed in a few slides back, you may just kind of shift your stand location a little bit closer to the bedding side, not close enough that you're going to bump them. So I still want to be, 150 yards away is about as close as I like to get kind of in the early season still. But that allows them to, because again, this time of year, a lot of times they're just going to push every activity back by an hour or two. So if they're walking by your stand at 4:15 p.m., now they may lay in their bed a little bit longer and get up a little bit closer to dark. So being closer to that bedding area rather than feeding can ensure that when they do cross your path, hopefully it's still within that legal shooting light. But here we go. This is where things really start to get interesting on the landscape. And as I mentioned earlier, again, everyone has their own motivation for hunting. And a lot of what we're going to talk about kind of focuses on bucks, but a lot of this is going to be just as true for does. And we'll try to throw in some doe specific stuff as we progress too. But now that we're hitting kind of late October, early November, this is when things really start to ramp up in the deer woods. And so a lot of people call this kind of the seeking phase of rut. And so this is when the bucks are just starting to search out. They're just starting to, maybe increase their home range a little bit and trying to search for that first doe that's in estrus. Now, typically there's not going to be a doe in estrus until, November 7th or so is kind of when that first one typically hits in Illinois, maybe a little bit earlier. But they're going to start looking, particularly the younger bucks. They really don't know what's kind of happening with their body. They're going through some changes. The testosterone is really starting to ramp up, and they're not really sure what to do. So during this time, the bucks are going to be very active. It's a great time to utilize different calling tactics, to utilize different lures or scents. So maybe you can try putting out a doe estrus trail and see if that brings any of these bucks who are out there searching to find estrus. Maybe that can bring them your way. You'll also start to notice a lot of rubs and scrapes, which are starting to develop. And we'll go over that in the next few slides, what those exactly are and what they mean. Now, if you're focused on does, I'm going to focus on the transition areas between bedding and food. And you'll hear me say this as we kind of move through rut. But if you're interested in harvesting a buck during rut, the easiest strategy you can do is to forget about bucks and act like you're hunting the does. Because again, the bucks have one thing on their mind at this time of year, and that's breeding as many does as they can. And so if you're hunting where the does are, the bucks are going to be there. Whether or not you see them is kind of a different story, but they are going to be near. They're going to be searching through these areas. They're going to be cruising through these areas.
I'm sure you can agree, Dan, Jason, and Curtis. This time of year is probably like my favorite time to sit in the woods. The amount of action you can see by just, touching the antlers a little bit lightly together. You can see all sorts of young bucks, getting amped up and super juiced up about fighting, and you can see them raking trees, and it's just an awesome time in the woods, and you get to see a lot of neat things in nature.
It is. And, a lot of people will kind of take vacation or schedule, a big trip kind of right around rut. I have personally found what I call kind of the seeking phase or pre-rut to be far more productive in terms of hunting. My most productive and my favorite day to be in the woods every single year is Halloween. It's just one of those days that seems to be truly magical out there. The bucks are just on their feet. They're cruising. They're not as cautious, because again, that testosterone is really starting to build in their body, and they're not really thinking with their brains anymore. And so it's like Adam said, it's a great time to get out. But late October, another really important strategy, and I think a lot of people don't give this enough effort during the season, is scout. I really implore people, even if you're hunting on public land, I know chances are you may run into another hunter, and I'll give you some techniques for that in a second. But getting out there and finding fresh sign during the season is arguably the most important step you can take. It's what's going to give you the best return on your investment. It's just boots on the ground scouting. And so in late October, you're going to start to see these scrapes and these rubs basically everywhere. And that's a pretty good sign that there's buck activity in your area. Now, if you are scouting during season, what I typically do is I'm not going to go out and scout, right at daylight or right at sunset. I'm going to, most deer hunters, they're going to be out for the first 4 hours of the day and kind of the last 4 hours of the day. So typically midday, kind of 11 o'clock to like 2 is when it can be a pretty good time to get in some scouting, because you're not going to mess up anybody's active sits. Again, there's still maybe people out there, but that's a great time to kind of walk around.
Yeah, not to mention also after a rain, if there's a big windstorm or a bunch of rain and there's a bunch of leaves that shift around on the ground and cover the scrapes, it's a perfect time to get in the woods and see which scrapes are actually active, because those bucks will want to freshen those up as soon as possible after the storm. So you'll really be able to get on the fresh sign and see what is actually going on real time in the woods.
Perfect.
Hey guys, one thing I just thought of too, like you said, Dan, scouting away from the peak time. Like if I'm a hunter, if I have the whole day to hunt and it's good, occasionally I might sit out there all day. And early in the morning, I don't really want to see people walking by me. But once you get to 10, 11, 12, if I'm sitting all day and I see somebody walking, I'm almost excited. So I'm like, ooh, I wonder what they're going to kick up when they, continue on.
Yeah, that's a great point. Now we'll kind of give a quick discussion of what rubs are. So obviously, this is an area of a tree where a buck is going to be rubbing his antlers to the point where he basically removes all of the outer bark from that specific tree. Now, mature bucks are going to establish their what we call kind of rub lines. You can see it here in the bottom graphic. So very often when a deer makes a rub, it's not just kind of this unique solitary thing. It's normally connected to other rubs. And so if you're ever out there and you happen to find a fresh rub, stop in your tracks and just kind of do a quick 360, just spin and look around probably 10 to 15 yards ahead in every direction, chances are eventually you're going to find another one and another one and another one. And you're going to start to see it form kind of this rub line, for lack of a better term. But they're going to establish these rub lines along routes that they feel the most safe and the most secure using. And so when you find a rub line, you are kind of in that buck's, what I like to say is you're in his bedroom. That is his main corridor. That's his home range. That's the area he's willing to defend. And that's a really good sign when you're out there. Now, rubs are oftentimes abandoned as the season progresses, particularly if they're, in this specific graphic here in the bottom, you can see there's 2 bucks there. Maybe you bump them out of that bed very, very aggressively and very hard. That might again cause them to kind of abandon that bed. And in doing so, they're going to abandon that rub line. And so having trail cameras to kind of monitor that rub line can be very effective. But essentially what they're doing is they're using these as communication tools. And so at the base of a buck's antler, he has 2 scent glands. And as he's rubbing the bark on this tree, he's going to be depositing a scent on that tree. And so he's using that to basically communicate through other deer through this kind of scent dispersal. And now a lot of times you'll see, small rubs that are on, a tree that's maybe, as thick as a pencil or maybe as thick as kind of an expo dry erase marker. And then other times you'll find ones that looks like a cow or an elk hit, just because it's like this 12-inch diameter tree and it's just torn to shreds. Not always does size equal, size of rub equal size of deer, but a lot of times it's a pretty good indication.
Yeah, but it's not a fork horn rubbing down on that 12-inch.
Exactly. Now, another really common sign that you're going to see and is really good to see when you're out hunting is scrapes. And so there's a couple different types of scrapes, but what we're going to focus on first is just kind of a quick overview of scrapes and how deer use them. And one thing I want to make pretty clear, when I first started deer hunting, I focused on scrapes. Every time I found a scrape, you watch the Buckmasters on TV or the Bill Jordan's Real Tree, and they find a scrape, they sit on it, and they shoot a buck that night. So I thought, as a kid, okay, I'm going to sit on this scrape, and I would sit an individual scrape, for a week, and then find another one, sit another week, and I'd never see anything. And I can't, why? What's happening? Well, a lot of it is deer aren't using these scrapes during daylight hours. A lot of research from GPS collared deer shows that they are actively checking these scrapes between about 2 and 3 a.m. And obviously that's outside of kind of legal shooting lighting. There's still a very small percent of daytime scrape visitation, but that's one technique that trail cameras can really help you pinpoint and help you narrow down, so that you're maybe, if you want to sit over scrape, now you can confirm, okay, well, they're actually using that scrape during daylight hours. That's a pretty good sign. But very similar rubs, scrapes are another communication tool between deer. Now, scrapes are often made by bucks, but does will often make their own and kind of use them as well. Now, when a buck creates a scrape, you can kind of see here in this picture, you can basically see his hoof marks, for lack of a better term, his toe marks, as he's kind of dragging all the vegetation off. And so he's creating this big circle of kind of bare soil. And what he's going to do is he's going to go stand in that soil and he's going to urinate down his back legs. Now, inside of a buck's back legs, he has 2 kind of tarsal glands that are basically where your kneecap would be. And he's going to urinate down his legs. It's going to pick up those pheromones from those scent glands inside his legs and deposit that on the ground. And a lot of times what he's doing is he's saying, I'm here, this is my territory. And what he's hoping is an old doe is going to come wandering by. She's going to be an estrus and she's, oh, okay, let's breed. And then she's going to basically urinate, deposit her estrus in this scrape. And then he's going to start tracking her and he's going to start tailing her. And so scrapes can be really, really productive for that. But I also want to point out that a lot of people create what they call mock scrapes. So they'll create this, basically they'll just go out into an area, clear up a portion of leaves, make it look like this, and then deposit some scent in it. And hopefully that draws any other buck that's in the area. He says, wait, I'm the mature buck in the area, not this imposter over here. And oftentimes that'll cause that other real buck in the area to come investigate. And if you're kind of there and set up for a shot, that can be a great option. Now, primary scrapes are scrapes that are oftentimes very big. A lot of times they can be up to 5 feet in diameter. And again, a lot of this sign that we're talking about, the rubs and scrapes, it's all starting to appear kind of mid-October, but you're really going to start seeing it everywhere as we progress closer and closer to Halloween. But these primary scrapes, you can see what this buck here is doing. And I mentioned when they're making rubs, they're depositing their scent from those glands at the base of their antlers on the tree. They're basically doing the exact same thing on this, what we call as a licking branch. And so very commonly on top of scrapes, you'll see a little horizontal branch that's maybe, 4 or 5 feet off of the probably not, let's say 4 feet off the ground, and you'll see a little broken twig on it. And that's kind of where he's been messing with his antlers. He's been licking it. He's been biting it. And again, he's just depositing that scent there. I see we have a question. I missed it. How do you differentiate primary from secondary rubs? Good question. And so here we're talking about scrapes. That is a pretty common misnomer in kind of deer hunting. People will call rubs scrapes and call scrapes rubs. So rubs are on trees where you're kind of rubbing, where the deer's rubbing the bark off. A scrape is going to be on the ground where they're scraping the vegetation away. And the biggest way to tell the difference between kind of a primary and secondary scrape, a lot of times it's just going to be the size. So the real big scrapes that you see that are 5 feet in diameter and are just huge, those are what we call primary scrapes. And now I will caution you, if you're on private land or on public land, if you think you're the first person to find a scrape, particularly if it's in an area that maybe it's just kind of on the edge of a big field, chances are you're not going to be the first person that happens to find that scrape. So just kind of keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, Dan, I do like to refer to these primary scrapes sometimes as car hood scrapes because they are basically the size of a car hood.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned, on public land, can be a little bit overhunted, but if you find the right one in a good location, it is at least a good spot to maybe run a trail camera to see what comes into the area, so you can at least get an idea of what deer are in that location.
And thanks, Adam. I also want to highlight this kind of bottom bullet here. Utilizing a deer drag can be effective. So this is actually how I killed my buck last year. I found a pretty regularly visited scrape. I took a piece of string and tied some cotton to the end of it. I think I actually used one of my wife's like cotton swabs that she cleans her face off with or whatever. And I sprinkled some doe estrus in it. And I went into that scrape, dropped it on the ground, and I drug it about 100 yards to my stand location. When this buck came in, he had his nose to the ground, following exactly where that scent drag started and where it came. And he basically came right into 10 yards. So that is another really good strategy. If you happen to find a scrape and maybe for some reason you're just not having success, you're not seeing deer, try different things. Try, utilizing a deer drag, get some doe estrus or some doe urine and just kind of sprinkle it on that scrape. See if that convinces anything to start actively visiting that specific scraper. Maybe you want to try to drag it to you. It's a very useful technique, and I thought it was worth kind of bringing up again. So now we get into a couple examples, and now as I mentioned a few minutes ago, when I say we're hunting rut, and I made the comment that a lot of times when you're hunting rut, forget about the bucks and focus on the does. This is the example why. And so very commonly, you're going to start to see in late October and early November, you're going to start to see these bucks. Again, they're kind of in that seeking phase. They're in that cruising phase. So they're going to be walking on the downwind side of bedding areas, hoping that they can just pick up a doe that's in estrus, they can smell her, and then at that point, they'll go in and start harassing her and start chasing her in hopes that they can breed her. So when I'm focusing late October, early November, very commonly, if I haven't found any new rub lines, I haven't found many scrapes, I'm going to find the biggest doe bedding or the most abundant doe bedding area that I have found, and I'm going to sit on the downwind side of it in the hopes that a buck is going to do exactly what you see in this picture. And it happens very commonly. And this is another really good example of kind of showing the topography and how that kind of influences deer movement. And so in this specific example, I have this nice doe bedding area that's kind of up top. And I know if a deer gets inside of that valley, that's just kind of on the south side of that, they're not going to be able to smell anything coming out of the bedding area. So they're going to want to stay, up tight to it on the ridge and stay right in line with it, and have that predominant wind push all the scent from the bedding area to them. And they'll be able to quickly check and see if a doe is in heat. And then again, if they are, that's when he'll commence. And like Curtis said, deer are not very romantic. So he will certainly go in there, harass and chase that doe for a long period of time. But focusing on the downwind side of doe bedding areas is a great strategy as we get closer and closer to kind of peak rut. But here we go. Now we are in early November to mid-November. This is what most hunters are going to call peak rut. So this is where you're going to see actively chasing. I sat a stand on public land in Illinois last year. I think it was November 6th, and I counted 18 different bucks in one sit. Now, obviously, I mean, they weren't all, underneath my stand. They were honestly 100 to 200 yards away, pretty much every single one of them. But that just goes to show the level of activity that you're likely to see during this time. Again, they are not near as cautious. The bucks, the testosterone is flowing, and all they have on their mind is breeding as many does as they can. And so this is when calling can be very effective. I also like to do a lot of my calling in kind of late October. So Halloween is when I typically will start my calling efforts. I don't do a ton of calling prior to that. But when we talk about calling, there's kind of two different schools of thought. So there's blind calling and there's targeted calling. Now, this blind calling is just kind of pulling out your calls and just using them and kind of making sound and sending it out to the void of the forest and hoping that something hears you and is receptive and then comes in. I personally don't like to hunt that way. Deer are very perceptive, especially on public land. They get called at a lot. They hear a lot of calls. So I try to be a little bit more selective with my calling. I like to be able to watch the specific animal that I'm calling at and understand what his or her reaction is to that specific call. And so early November, mid-November, if I have a buck that's coming through and he's cruising for does, I might use a grunt call and just throw a couple quick, just just a couple quick grunts and watch his body language, see how he reacts. If he turns his body and faces you and his ears tucked back, go ahead and pick up your bow, because at that point, chances are he's coming to defend his territory and he's kind of riled up. But if it's a little more cautious and maybe he just kind of looks and just goes about his way, I might try it again and just kind of see his reaction. But that deer will arguably tell you whether to call more or to just give up and stop calling. So again, you can kind of call into the void and hope something happens, or you can be a lot more selective about it. But again, same strategies as early October or late October, but I'm going to be focused specifically on doe bedding areas. I'm going to be on the downwind side of doe bedding areas, pretty much majority of these sits during kind of early November to mid-November, unless I happen to pick up on a brand new fresh rub line or maybe a new scrape set. Then I might kind of transition my hunting strategy, but primarily I'm going to be focused on that downwind side of doe bedding areas. And if you're having trouble finding doe bedding areas, the easiest way is to pull up Google Earth and just look at the satellite map and try to find fields that look overgrown. And so we'll show a few more examples as we progress through this, but a few of the examples before where we kind of showed you doe bedding areas, you notice they're just these random fields in the middle of a forest that kind of look like the forest is starting to take back over the field. Those are great places for doe bedding areas.
Okay. One thing I don't think we've mentioned yet about the rut. A lot of people might think about weather influencing that. And like Dan said earlier, weather changes are always good for animal movement in general, but the rut is actually centered around photo period, so length of day. And so it is pretty set in stone. So if you're wanting to take a vacation right now, you can, like Dan said, set it for about Halloween into the first few days of November, and that's typically going to be your funnest time to be in the deer woods if you can do it.
That's a great point. Yeah, you'll hear a lot of people say that the moon phases influence rut. that the weather kind of starts rut, but like Curtis mentioned, it's that photo period. Now, weather, like he mentioned, can certainly dictate an increased movement and activity, but it's not going to increase rutting behavior.
Yeah, for example, this past deer season, it was like pretty abnormally warm, if you guys would agree. And obviously the deer were still chasing, maybe not as much as you would see if it was like 30 degrees and slightly snowing, kind of like it is today. But still, nonetheless, they were chasing. The does were still in heat, and the rut was, in full swing.
Yeah, I remember opening day of firearm season. I shot a deer in a t-shirt. It was so black. But now we get into, again, we're still kind of in this early November, and I'm going to show you kind of an example of a rattling setup, because I know a lot of people like to be a little bit more aggressive. In my hunting style, as you've probably picked up on, and that I don't like to blind call, I like to be fairly, what's the opposite of aggressive? Oh, I'm blanking on words, but non-aggressive for lack of a better term. And so this is an example of, if you decide to get a little bit more aggressive, this can be a great strategy to employ, especially kind of early November. It can also fall into the late October period as well. But this is a rattling setup. And so thank you, Curtis. Calm. Yes. So this is a rattling setup. And what we're trying to imitate with a rattling setup is basically trying to imitate two mature bucks fighting, in the hope that there's another buck in the area that says, whoa, these two deer do not belong. This is my territory. This is my home range. In the theory that other mature buck is going to come in and try to interrupt the fight and run the other two bucks off. Now, there's a couple schools of thought with rattling. The first thing is, don't overdo it. You're going to hear people rattling pretty much constantly throughout deer season on public ground. So you don't need to overdo it. I like to mix a lot of grunts, wheezes, as well as kind of other sounds. And so if you think about what 250-pound deer would sound like actually fighting, it's not going to be this little just kind of clink, clink, clink with your antlers. You're going to hear foot stomping. You're going to hear tree branches breaking. You're going to hear vegetation. And so a lot of times, if you're trying to elicit that very testosterone driven kind of fight response in a deer, a lot of times that's what it's going to take. So oftentimes when I'm rattling, I'm typically not going to be doing it in the tree. I like to be on the ground so that I can kind of smack the vegetation, kind of stomp my feet a little bit, and just try to sound a little bit more realistic. But when I choose an area to rattle, I am going to try to get into that deer's core range. And so as when we discussed rubs a little bit earlier, we talked about how very often when a buck makes a rub line, that is basically, adjacent to his bedding site. It's his home range. He feels very secure there. So I'm going to personally try to invade that as I do my rattling. Now, of course, you want the wind direction to be favorable. So you don't want it to be coming from the rub line or from the bed. But I also like to set up in an area like this that has a lot of topography behind me, because what's very common with deer, and this is one reason why I don't do a lot of blind calling, is they're going to try and circle downwind of you to try to smell you first. That's just common. They do it with live deer too. If they happen to see another buck in the area, very commonly, they're going to circle downwind to try to see if they can smell that deer before they go in. And so you want to set up in an area where hopefully that's not possible. And so an area like this, that can be a little bit favorable, because now they don't have that option to kind of circle behind you. But when I'm rattling, oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Hey, I just want to point out, if one of my favorite memories, I don't remember doing it one time with my dad, but when I was a kid, I was sitting with my dad, and he's like, yo, shake that branch and make some noise. And I was like, really? Because I was so used to him being strictly quiet. And so if you have a kid with you, do some rattling. It might not work, but it would be fun though. So it's just something to consider. It gives him the ability to break out of trying to be a statue and actually have some fun sitting next to you, and get some energy out too, maybe.
And that actually brings up a good point, kind of an overall comment on deer hunting. You can go ahead and transition to the next slide while I finish this. But a lot of people think that you have to be, dead quiet, dead still when you're hunting. And while that's certainly important, to be cautious about your sound, but remember, these are wild animals. They are very, very comfortable with squirrels rummaging in the leaves beneath them, jumping from tree to tree, jumping from the tree to the ground. So normal sounds like that don't really disturb them too much. Now they may pick up on it and say, oh, that's weird, and they may just kind of go the other way, but it's certainly not going to bump them or push them out of the area. So when you're walking to your deer stand and you're walking to your spot, you don't have to be dead silent. You want to just try to sound like you fit in. And I know of a few hunters who will actually carry a turkey diaphragm call with them. And now I don't necessarily recommend that, but you certainly could. And as they're kind of walking into their spot, they'll just quickly do a couple yelps, maybe do a couple clucks, and just to portray the image that I'm not a hunter, I'm just a turkey walking through this area. And so you don't always have to be quiet.
Yeah, what I feel like
now,
spooked deer is more of like your consistent walking, like, you're walking like a human on two legs, moving very quickly, or even if you're trying to be like super sneaky, and at that point they can still hear something and they might think it's a predator coming in. But if you're, walking in kind of, like Dan said, more relaxed, you can break a stick or two and be okay. You don't have to, feel like you blew out that whole area.
Good point. Now, another strategy that you can use is decoys. Now, I will say I personally do not use decoys. I find them to be somewhat cumbersome. They're big and bulky, and I haven't had that much success using them. The only time I actually had success, pretty funny story. It's important, I promise. We were out at a piece of public land private land in Missouri. We had a family friend who owned 40 acres, and he invited us up to hunt. It was when I first started deer hunting, so it was my first probably year deer hunting. I bought a decoy. I was like, yeah, I'm so cool. I'm going to carry this thing out, put it up. And of course, I happened to leave it in the field overnight, which that's the learning point here. Don't leave your decoy out in the field. We came back to basically this shredded mass of just foam and fake deer pieces spread across the field. Because at some point in the night, another buck came by and probably saw it and thought, oh my God, there's another, and went and attacked it and just ended up destroying the whole thing. So they can be effective, but don't leave it out overnight, and also be a little discreet about it. Again, if you're on public land, there's going to be other people who are looking for deer. And if they happen to see your deer decoy, they may not be able to tell that it's a decoy. But decoys can be useful. Particularly if you're wanting to get a little bit more aggressive with your setup, and maybe you want to do a rattling scenario but have a decoy there, so that when that buck happens to sneak out of his bedding area to see what's going on, he actually has something to look at. That can be very effective. Now, I would say you want to reduce as much residual human scent on the decoy as possible. So a lot of people kind of spray it with a scent-free spray. Hint, just use baking soda and water. That makes a pretty solid scent eliminator. Excuse me. And then some people also put in some buck urine if it's a buck decoy, or maybe some doe estrus if it's a doe decoy. But again, can be used. Just use it sparingly and do it in kind of a safe and methodical way. But it can be very effective to convince that deer to take that next 10 steps that you might need him to get in your range. So there's sometimes where you probably will wish you had had a decoy. But then there's times you'll have it out there if you take one and you're like, man, I really wish I would have left that home today. All right, so early November, if we're still, let's say we're focused on does. Again, like I mentioned during rut, I and many other successful deer hunters are primarily always focused on does during the rut, because again, that's where the bucks are going to be. So I'm again going to be focused. Maybe again, I haven't found any fresh sign. I'm just kind of starting. I'm going to focus on the downwind side of the bedding area. I like to find trails that kind of run parallel to either a doe bedding area or a food source, because those are going to be very, very, very common buck paths as he kind of scent checks these fields. Because again, at this point in time, there's not a ton of does that have gone into full estrus yet. And so especially like November 3rd, November 4th, there's not going to be many. And so he's going to be trying to cover as much ground as he can to try to find that one specific doe that happens to be in estrus. Now, if you happen to be on the piece of property or near the area that has that first doe in estrus, just buckle up, because it will be probably the hunt of a lifetime. I think that's what happened last year when I had those 18 different bucks kind of run by. I think I just happened to have the first doe that came into estrus in what felt like the county, and every buck just came from a mile away to try to harass her and prove their quote unquote worth. But this time of year, again, keep focusing on those downwind side of bedding or of feeding. Pay attention to the wind direction, use calls sparingly, and you should have a pretty successful hunt. So now we get to what is really considered peak rut. This is kind of the tending phase. And this is when things, I find things start to really slow down in the woods. And so I'll give a quick overview of what tending is and how deer tend. I think it's important, but essentially if a doe is in estrus, again, you're going to have an exciting hunt. There's going to be bucks following, chasing. Now when that doe fully comes into estrus, because typically they're going to show the signs of estrus about 24 hours ahead of actually entering estrus. And so the buck will be able to realize that she's in estrus again about 24 hours before she's actually ready. And that's when he's just going to, again, he's going to attempt to breed her. He's going to be chasing her, and he's going to harass her until she begins to be receptive. And sometimes they'll even do this after she exits estrus. They'll continue trying to breed in these things. But this means that a single doe is typically going to get a buck's attention for about 2 to 3 days. And if you think about what that does to deer hunting, it kind of removes their movement from the landscape, because a lot of times when they're doing this kind of tending phase, they're going to be locked down in a very specific, very thick area, and they're not really going to move there much. They might kind of get up and stretch and nibble and take a quick drink, and they'll be right back there. So they don't really like to leave these areas once they're kind of in this tending phase. But when a buck finds an estrus doe, again, he's going to do anything he can to defend her from other bucks. So he's going to try to find the gnarliest, the thickest habitat where they can get away from everybody and really begin to kind of pair off. And once these bucks begin to pair off, they're going to spend 2 or 3 days with each doe. And that's when things get, I find, really slow in the woods, just because, again, they're not up and moving. They're in this lockdown phase. And so if you're focused on hunting this lockdown phase, it can be a little trickier. Now, again, every deer is not going to be on the same cycle. So there will be some bucks who are finished with the doe, and then they're going to search for another one, and vice versa. So there is still going to be some of that kind of cruising and searching. But if you're focused on harvesting a big mature buck this time of year, kind of in the tending phase, it's going to be very difficult, but you're going to have to get as close to them as you can. But typically, like Curtis said, it's a good time to take a break, give the deer a few days to do their breeding, and kind of re-hit it, the next week or so. Now, after breeding, the does will pretty much go back to their normal daily routines, basically exactly as they exit this kind of estrus. And once the buck departs her, she's going to attempt to rejoin up with her family group. And he's going to, again, continue on his way and start searching for others to breed. But now as we progress through November, we start to see another uptick in activity kind of, end, I'd say November 17th, kind of then on is when I'm going to go back to that bed to feed pattern. You can still pick up on some rutting activity, but it's certainly not abundant. And a lot of times it's going to be some of the younger bucks who may not have had a chance to breed a doe yet. They're going to be up on their feet. But as we approach December, that's when things really start to take a different turn in the deer woods. You start to, again, weather changes, but you also have this concept of a second rut. And so does who do not get successfully bred during the first rut, they will re-enter an estrus cycle 28 days after that first cycle. And so typically November 7th through 14th is kind of peak rut for Illinois. And so you can view second rut kind of December 4th through the 10th or 12th. Now you're not going to see a huge uptick in activity like you did during the primary rut, but you still can see some rutting activity during the second rut, particularly with the fawns. There are some doe fawns who, if they hit a certain body condition and they get, a certain size and development, that they will actually go into estrus during this kind of second cycle. So you can, there are more does that are coming into estrus essentially, but I'm still going to be focused on the food to bed patterns, or the bed to feed, whichever, whether you're hunting in morning or evening, and not so much on rut activity. Now, late season is when things get, I find personally late season to be arguably the best time of year for the way I personally hunt. Now, obviously rut is exciting, it's active, but there is nothing like a late season hunt where there's 6 inches of fresh snow on a field and you're overlooking this bottomland area and it looks like you have every single deer in the county within your vision, because that is very common during the late season. Again, food sources are going to become less and less common in the landscape. There's going to be very scarce food. All the crops have pretty much been harvested by this point. The acorns have pretty much been consumed for the most part. And so you're going to start to see some pretty drastic changes. And if you happen to find a active food source during late season, there's typically not going to be just 1 or 2 deer using it. It's going to be kind of the entire herd in that area will be using it. And very often it'll look like there was kind of a touch or tackle football game out in the field, just because it's so dug up from them having to dig through the snow to find different food sources, but typically they're going to be browsing. They'll also hit the ag fields if there is some waste grain. They'll dig through the snow to find that. But primarily you're going to be focused on kind of browsing type conditions. Now, during the late season, I personally like to focus on afternoon hunts, because again, we're hunting kind of the evening food sources. So morning hunts are a little bit more, or a little bit less productive during this time of year, I should say. They can still be productive and you can still have a successful hunt, but I like to kind of put the odds in my favor. And so I typically prefer afternoon, evening hunts, or even midday hunts. But what I'm really focused on, again, is those south facing slopes like we discussed earlier, but also changing weather patterns. If you have 5 days of cold and then you have a couple warm days, go sit that first warm day. If you have a few warm days followed by a cold snap, go sit that first cold snap. These changing weather patterns always kick up deer activity pretty quickly, as it causes them to have to transition food sources and bedding locations and things like that. So it's a really great option for late season, is just focus on these changing weather patterns.
And Dan, one thing I thought of that mainly applies to hunters that maybe you've got your own piece of private ground, so pressure's not as much of an issue, and you are hunting big bucks. One benefit, if you wait until the late season, then you can be pretty sure that big mature buck still had a chance to breed with the does, so his genetics will be passed on. Now, for public land, I'm notoriously not picky, so I'm gonna shoot whatever. But if you've got the luxury of hunting private and no pressure, that's one little benefit of the late season too.
Sure, great point. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason, and we're going to go through this last example before we close out.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan. So we're going to talk real quick. We're going to use public land here as an example to find a spot and where to set up at. So this is from the huntillinois.org website that the DNR came out with last fall. If you're not familiar with it, go check it out. And there's a tutorial on there. You can kind of figure out the different tools and applications they have associated with this website. So you can go there and see what site you're interested in hunting in. You can also, to help narrow that down with all those sites that are available, you can look at the public lands hunting report, and you can use this to look at total hunt acres, total hunt trips, and see how many deer or species of interest were taken off of that plot of land the year before. And that gives you an idea of how productive the land is. And an example of this, we're going to look at moraine view. So you can calculate a few things out real easily by just dividing a few numbers here. And that might help you rank your different sites that you're interested in hunting and give you an idea of which one might be more productive than the other, or which one might have higher hunting pressure than the other. So looking at deer abundance, at least for a guess at what deer abundance may be, just by looking at how many deer were harvested per acre. you can look at the 41 deer that were harvested in archery and divide that by total huntable acres. So that goes to 0.03. Then you can look at hunting effort. So you can see how many deer were harvested per total hunting trips. That gives you 0.29. And then look at the pressure that's there. So you can see total hunt trips and huntable acres and see how many hunters there are per acre of that land. And just to give you an idea again, so deer abundance, you want this number to be high, you want hunting effort to be high, and you want that hunter abundance to be a lower number if you're comparing sites. Again, you can go there to this website, which is huntillinois.org, and use their hunt planner to help you find a site. You can either do a specific site. So I looked up Moraine View for this example. You can also go near me, which will put in your zip code and see where there's a site near you at. You can go by county. You can go by one of the 5 regions of the state that the DNR has the state divided up into, or you can just go for the entire state. So I put Moraine View, and we got the site-specific regulations for that. So this pops up, and you can look at the site-specific regs, and then you can click on deer. So this is all drop-down tabs. So hit site-specific regs, hit deer, and then this gives you all of the information there for the site-specific regulations on deer hunting. You can see here that firearm muzzleloader is not permitted at the site, so that's why all the deer that were taken from there were archery deer. And it's important to check these out, see if there's any windshield card requirements, see if there's any check-in, check-out requirements, and hunting hours for these sites, because each site varies. So the site also gives you a site map. The website gives you a site map. So you can look up, this is Moraine View. You can see the boundary of the site, and you can see all the different parking lot access points for the site. And if you click on the species to the right here, that will show you the area on that site that you're permitted to hunt at. So I did that. And here you can see where you're allowed to hunt deer at this site. And again, it's important to look at your access points, your boundaries, and where you're not allowed to hunt at. So then going forward, I think Adam's going to show us how he's going to break this site down and where he might be interested in hunting at.
Yep. Thanks, Jason. So here I basically just took screenshots of a mapping system. And what I first did was, of course, identify the access points. So this site, Moraine View, is primarily known as a controlled pheasant site. So it does have a lot of parking lots and a lot of different fields, but they do allow deer hunting as well. So of course I marked all the parking lots, and in the red X there, I just marked the site office. And I believe for this site, you did need to sign in and sign out every time that you wanted to hunt there. So that was another mark that I made that's pretty important. And moving on, then I just spent some time marking all the different areas. So in purple, we have an outline around the lake. Of course, there's no hunting there, just, for safety reasons. In yellow, I marked the no hunt zones. So you have one here on the close to the main office. And I believe there was one close to the southern parking lot as well. There was just a perimeter there where there was no hunting. And then I really dove in deep and tried to figure out where I would spend most of my time scouting and hunting, hopefully. So scouting first, obviously, just to make sure I knew what was in the area and that the area was good. But so what I did here was kind of took some time and marked these shapes here outlined in red. And I did, on this mapping system, you can do kind of line distances. So I tried to do lines from each parking lot that were about a quarter of a mile into the public land. So we're towards the middle. We know that a lot of people don't like to travel very far from the parking lot to hunt. So I kind of used quarter mile as my base, and I drew these polygons, basically just outlining where the quarter of a mile would be. So theoretically, you'd have these areas to yourself, or at least you try to find an area that has a lot less hunting pressure inside the public land. So I marked these on the map, and then of course you'd want to go out in there, check it out, see what it looks like on foot, make sure that you have food, bedding, and water in all these locations that you want to hunt. And then you can narrow your hunting spots down from there. But that's basically what I did, all by just looking at it on a map online.
Yeah, and like Adam said, this is kind of how I personally break down all of a new hunting site. Let's say I'm going to a new public site and I want to start scouting it. This is the first thing I'm going to do is figure out where the access points are, which tells me where other hunters are likely to be, and that's going to tell you where hunters are likely not going to be. And oftentimes that can lead you to what a lot of people call quote unquote sanctuary. So they may be these areas that are just far enough back that people aren't willing to travel. But also taking it a step further than this map illustrates, also look at some of the topographic features. If there's a really steep incline, or maybe there's a water crossing that you have to wear, waders or something, just any obstruction that's going to, deter other hunters from going to that area. Typically that's a good sign for any deer hunter. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're out there scouting. Try to find these areas that other people are not spending time. And like Adam said, the easiest way is to look where the parking is, and try to go a quarter to a half mile from there, and hope that works out.
Yeah, I do just want to point out, this is kind of a funky example, just again, because this is mainly a controlled pheasant site. So generally there will not be that many parking lots surrounding the public area, but this was kind of a funky example that we did want to show. But this still works for this example as well. So just keep that in mind.
And as we develop a scouting plan, and then maybe we get in there and scout, and we find some of these bedding sites that we discussed, or maybe we find a nice funnel or pinch point. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to decide what winds I think I can hunt out of that stand. I'm going to figure out, can I actually get to the stand, get into it, quietly without disturbing the deer, and can I get out of there without disturbing the deer? That's equally as important. If you're in an area, maybe you're hunting over a big food source, and the only way for you to get out of it and get back to your truck is to walk, across the food source while all the deer are feeding out there in the evening, that's not going to be a very advantageous thing. So we want to try to find the easiest entry and exit ways into a stand. And oftentimes, I personally use a lot of creek beds, whether they have a little bit of water in them or whether they're dry. They allow you a nice, easy access where you can be a little bit quieter, again, because there's some water or some rock. But what it also does is it kind of drops you in elevation a little bit. I try to get as low as I can when I'm walking to a stand, not necessarily crawl, but just kind of low in terms of elevation. I don't want to be up on a ridge where they can see my silhouette kind of across the sky. So creek beds are one of my favorite ways to access. I also like to look what gear I'm going to need. There's nothing worse than getting there opening morning and realizing, crap, I'm in this specific tree and I need this type of deer stand. So I take copious notes when I'm out there hunting. I have a little hunt journal that I call it, and I take notes diligently. And over time, that will really start to build up your knowledge of deer ecology, your knowledge of hunting, and also kind of some new strategic approaches. Because deer are the easiest way to say is the landscape in Illinois does not change that often, as many of us have noticed. And deer are creatures of habit. And so very commonly, these deer are going to use the same areas year after year after year. There might be some kind of minor revisions to the trail that they use at a certain time, but arguably they're going to be using the same areas year after year. So having this kind of, what I call it is it's a living journal that I'm always adding information to. I'm always kind of revisiting old hunts and looking what I saw, when I saw it, what came through, what did I do wrong, what did I do right? And that can really help you kind of refine and understand kind of the breadth of information of hunting. Because once you start to really dive in, there's a lot of information that you can kind of use to kind of guide where you're going to put your stand. But it's all about what makes you feel comfortable, what gets you out in the woods the most, and what allows you to get a successful harvest. So a lot of times on public land in Illinois, you cannot create shooting lanes or access trails. So you're not allowed to remove or cut any living vegetation. Now, if you're on private land, go crazy, assuming the landowner is okay with you doing so, but creating shooting lanes to allow you to have a nice open lane for your arrow or for your bullet to travel as it hits a deer trail. And so these are all the things that I'm thinking out when I'm out there. I'm not necessarily just saying, oh, this looks like a good spot, I'll be here Monday. It's a very thought-provoking experiment, and just getting out there, looking over the land. I always will carry, whether it's ladder sticks to allow me to climb up a tree, or sometimes I might even take a full tree stand with me when I'm scouting, so I can actually get up in that tree and see what it looks like from that specific area. And so I do implore you to do as much scouting as possible. There's not one thing, one gadget, one strategy that a hunter can do to better their odds of success than boots on the ground scouting. So that's my pitch.
One thing I want to add, kind of to your point of just constantly taking notes throughout the season. In the early season, obviously the trees still have leaves, and the wind, you might be set up in a spot that the wind is perfect, but that wind might totally change once the leaves are off the trees. So you again might have to adjust, take those notes, notice, if you aren't seeing deer come out of a certain trail when the leaves are off, that might be something to take into consideration as well. So this, like Dan said, this is a never ending, there's always a learning curve, and you're always constantly taking notes and learning as you go.
And so now we're going to close out with a little example. So let's say we're hunting November 5th. So this is kind of that early November, rut is really starting to kick off. They're not necessarily in the tending phase. There is probably some does that are in estrus. And let's say you found this doe bedding area. So as I mentioned earlier, when I'm looking for a doe bedding area, one of the first ways that I personally like to do is I'm going to look at satellite maps and look for these overgrown fields. Now, they're not always going to be doe bedding areas, and there's lots of other options for doe bedding, but it's a really good starting point, especially if you're just getting into hunting, or you're just starting to learn a new public or even private site. I'm always looking for these little forest openings that look like the forest is starting to kind of retake, and they're not necessarily early successional anymore. That those are arguably going to have quite a few different deer beds and doe beds in there. So our goal is to identify potential stand locations. We have the wind coming in from the northeast. It's about 7 miles per hour. So in Illinois, that's that's about as calm as we ever get these days, it seems like. We move to this next slide. Okay, so let's say we have a feeding area right here in this orange spot. Let's say it's an oak flat, and this is very common. A lot of people, when they look at a big forest, it's like, are they feeding in there? Yes, they are. They're going to be feeding in there a lot more readily, especially this time of year, as the acorns have started to drop. The hunting pressure is kind of at an all-time high this time of year, and so they're what some people will call nocturnal. I choose to think of it as they're still fairly, crepuscular and still like those twilight hours. They're just a little delayed. They're a little slow to get up in the morning and to get out of bed in the afternoon. They just take a little bit longer to do everything, just so they have that cover of darkness. And let's say we have this kind of nice doe bedding area here on the west. So you have a few different options of where you could set up a stand. Again, we have the wind coming in from the northeast, so Jason will kind of populate these options here. And I will say there is more than one correct answer. So I'll go ahead and launch this poll and just kind of get your guys' thoughts. Would you hunt stand A, B, C, or D? And if you need to go back, you can minimize the poll that popped up on your device. And then we'll discuss why I would hunt some of them and why maybe not some of the others. Okay, we've got a pretty decent spread. Nobody said C, so well done. We had a few people say location A, and we had a few people location B and location D. Okay, can you go ahead and advance to the next slide, Jason? So location B is a great option, because again, if we go back one slide really quick, Jason, and pay attention to the wind direction. So the wind direction is coming from the northeast. If you were to choose site A or site C, there's a pretty strong indication that that wind is going to blow directly over this bedding area. Now, if you had a more southerly wind, you could potentially get away with stand A. Again, I wouldn't. I'll explain that in a second, but C is kind of a bad option because, again, that wind is blowing right over the bedding area. If you can move forward, Jason. And so this is the route that we would expect deer to take. Perfect. So this is the route we would expect deer to take. We would expect the does to get up and just basically go straight from bedding to feeding. After they feed, they'll kind of meander around and they'll head back to bedding, theoretically again. Now, that buck, again, this is that peak rut. So this is November 5th. Things are really starting to get exciting. Does are in estrus. Bucks are going to want to check the downwind side of feeding and bedding areas to be able to search, because that wind is going to be pushing over these feeding and bedding areas. And so if there are any does that are in that field, he's instantly going to be able to smell them and be able to decide whether or not they're in estrus. And so in this specific example, I personally would target D. That gives you kind of the best of both worlds, because I'm like Curtis. He kind of mentioned, he's not very picky when he deer hunts. I'm not either. A lot of my deer hunting is just to fill the freezer so I don't have to buy beef for the year. So I will focus on an area like D, because that gives me the best of both worlds. It gives me the option to be able to harvest a doe that's just doing that basic bed to feed pattern, but it also gives me that option to potentially fill my buck tag if a buck happens to kind of wander through and wants to scent check the feeding and the bedding area. So this would be a great spot for that. Now, you could certainly hunt B as well, which is kind of on the southern side of the doe bedding area. Now, the only thing you're likely not going to catch there is you're not going to catch the does going from bedding to feeding, but you could certainly still catch that buck as he's kind of sneaking through and cruising that downwind side of the feeding and bedding area. And one thing I will caution you, if you're in an area like this and you happen to see the buck from 100 to 200 yards away, there are times where it will take that specific deer 2 hours to walk 50 yards, especially if it's a really mature, really old buck. They are extremely deliberate, extremely distinct with every single step and move they make. And so they do things at a very slow pace. And so if you're ever in a situation where it just seems like this buck is taking forever, don't give up hope. Chances are it's still working in the direction that you want it to. It's just moving at a slower pace because it's probably been exposed to hunters. It's getting pressure, and it's kind of a survival instinct. But this is how, personally, this is how a lot of my kind of late October into rut hunts look. And that's getting on the downwind side of either a bedding or a feeding area. And if I can pinpoint a bed to feed pattern, I want to get on the downwind side of that trail that I think the does are using going from bedding to feeding. But with that, I'll turn it over to Jason.
Thanks, Dan. So we're going to close out April, which has been pretty heavy on deer webinars. We're going to keep that going with some deer firearm and muzzleloader equipment overview on Thursday night. So join us for that if you're interested in getting into some firearm hunting in Illinois. And we'll be starting off May with land management activities for Illinois hunters. If you're just interested in how you can manage land to increase your deer or other game habitat, join us for that. We're going to be talking to some biologists and some habitat managers that work with Pheasants Forever. So it should be a really interesting discussion we have with them and very informative. Dan, if you want to say anything else about that program.
Yeah, and even if you don't have private land that you're actively managing for deer or for wildlife, what we're going to do is kind of take a two-pronged approach. And so we're going to focus at first on a lot of the habitat work that you're likely to see on public land. So if you're out there deer hunting and you happen to see maybe a prescribed fire, or maybe you start to see a bunch of trees that have been cut down, or maybe they've been girdled and sprayed, and we'll dive into why they do that, how that benefits other species of wildlife, but also how you can use that information as a hunter to kind of increase your success. Because when they're managing these areas, they're managing them for the wildlife. And very commonly, that's going to be game species. And so we as hunters can utilize a lot of that information to guide some of our strategic efforts. And I would like to say another quick reminder that I meant to put on here, but I forgot. If you have not submitted your first lottery application for the Illinois deer firearm or muzzleloader season next fall, the application period for the first lottery is open right now and expires at the end of the month. So if you're interested in hunting deer this upcoming fall with a firearm or muzzleloader, make sure to get that lottery application in the next week or so.
All right. Please follow us on our Facebook pages and other social media. And we're starting to highlight, I missed this from previous webinars, so if you haven't seen this link yet, we do have the Illinois Hunt Connection page, which is a Facebook group for people who have gone through our program. And you can click on that and ask to join it, and then one of us will verify you and allow you to come in there. And then you can ask that group any questions or get any ideas or anything like that from that group. And it's a really fun group to be a part of. So if you aren't joined on yet, check it out.
And if you're looking for future kind of hunting opportunities, we kind of frequently will have people kind of come through the program and maybe, they're ready to take out a new hunter, maybe go on a group pheasant hunt or group waterfowl hunt, join that group. And we post a lot of kind of just random hunts that they say, hey, anyone free Tuesday, whatever day and want to hunt this species here. And so it's a great way to just kind of, again, meet like-minded hunters and also try to go into some of our helps. We have a question from Joe. As a new deer hunter, if I'm using a ground blind or still hunting on public land, what is the etiquette between how I set up / use versus a tree stand hunter? Don't want to create any conflict in areas where I'm new in these guys. That's a fantastic question. So in summary, a lot of, I'll just start kind of at the beginning. So as you're deer hunting, very commonly, I personally want to be set up. I want to be completely in my tree stand, all my gear organized, completely ready to go about 30 minutes before legal shooting light. So that's about an hour before the official sunrise is when I want to be completely set up. And so obviously during that time, you will be encountering other hunters in the woods. Standard etiquette in the dark. A lot of us carry flashlights. And so you'll just kind of see people will just quickly click on their flashlight and kind of flash it at you just to let you know they're there. Now, my personal rule of thumb, I hunt a little bit different than a lot of people. So maybe Jason, Curtis, or Adam could jump in on this too. But I don't like to see or hear any other hunter while I'm out there. Now, I certainly won't get mad if somebody comes in and sets up near an area. But if I'm the one going into an area, I'm going to try to get 400 to 500 yards away from a person, just because, again, I don't know how much precaution they're personally taking with their scent, with how quiet they are on their entry. Maybe they're a smoker and they're up in their tree stand smoking. That does occasionally happen. So I like to get away from people as much as possible, so that if a mistake happens, in a deer spooks, that it's my fault and not somebody else. Now, a good rule of thumb is just to get far enough away that you don't feel like you're going to impact their hunt. I would say at a minimum about 300 to 400 yards is pretty much is a pretty safe bet. Now, when you're out there and interacting with other hunters, the majority of other hunters are just normal people wanting to do the exact same thing as you. And very commonly when I'm in a parking lot and there's 2 or 3 other guys getting ready, or even women, which is great to see these days, I'll say, hey, where are you going to be? And I don't ever expect them to say, hey, I'm going to be on top of this ridge facing this way, looking at this scrape. But they might say, yeah, I'm going, this way towards the back of the river, and then I'm going to head west a little bit. Well, that's good, because then that tells me they're going to that area. So I'm just going to go to a new area. And so when I'm out there scouting, I typically like to have about 4 or 5 different stand locations kind of picked out, so that I always have that backup plan in the back of my mind. If I get to an area, maybe I'm running late that morning, or maybe somebody's already beat me and I'm walking to my spot and I see them click on their headlight. Okay, at least I have some other backup plans I can go to without having to go straight back to bed. Now, in terms of using a ground blind versus a tree stand, in terms of etiquette, not an issue at all. Now, if you are hunting during the firearm season, you will want to make sure that your blaze orange is on the outside of your blind. So you do have to have blaze orange on the outside of your blind, in addition to the blaze orange that you're required to wear, just so that other hunters are aware that that blind is there. Because then, obviously the blaze orange doesn't do much if you're sitting inside of a camouflage blind. So hope that helps.
Hey, and one thing I wanted to throw in, if you do talk with other hunters in the parking lot, don't be afraid to use that. Say, hey, I'm a new deer hunter. I just don't want to step on your toes. And the vast majority of people once they hear you're a new hunter, they may give you their prime spot. Some of them might. So I certainly wouldn't be afraid to use that at all. And one quick thing I want to say about ground blinds. Ground blinds are awesome if you've got maybe a kid at home that wants to go and try out deer hunting, but you're worried about how still they can sit. You can get a nice ground blind comfortably sits 2, even 3 people, and a kid can even be in there playing Snake on the phone or whatever the kids are playing these days, and just look up when the deer comes. And really a great way to get them out there in a pretty easy to do it way.
Yeah, I actually took out my wife last firearm season. During the second firearm season, she drew a tag, and we brought up the ground blind, brought a little propane heater, and we had a great time. So ground blinds, I think they get a bad rap by a lot of people, but they can be extremely productive if you use them in the correct way. And the best way I can summarize it is make sure to brush it in. So cover it in some of the vegetation that's naturally in that area. So pick up broken sticks, broken limbs, maybe there's some dead grasses, and just kind of stack them against that blind to help just kind of, make it disappear into the landscape a little bit more.
Yep.
But with that,
Yeah.
go ahead, Jason.
Oh, we can get out of here because we're already going a little over time.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's okay.
Oh,
we can get out of
geez.
here. If
We
you guys
went
have
way- yeah.
questions, you can reach out to us on social media. I haven't looked at a clock in a while. I apologize for going over, but hopefully the information was all helpful for everybody. Any questions you may have, you can message us on Facebook. We'll get back to you. There's also an email address on our webpage as well. And one of us will get back to you with any questions you may have. We're a resource for you all, so please use us. And we appreciate y'all coming tonight. Maybe we'll see you on Thursday. Have a great evening.
Yeah. And if we don't see you Thursday, hopefully we'll see you out in the field sometime. Send us pictures. We love hearing new stories and seeing pictures and hearing hunting stories. So please feel free to reach out to us at any time.